heading out to Eden. Yeah, brother. Greetings, bookworms and Trekheads. I first acquired a copy of this as probably my 9th or 10th birthday. The Star Trek, the novelisation of the original series, Scripts, Volume 5. I think I first read this, I was probably age 9 or 10. I liked Star Trek at the time, but I didn't really pick it up and read it for quite a while. It might have been that, repeats were fairly constantly on, and I didn't really recognise the need for a novelisation of it, but once I picked it up, I was quite glad I did. Stumbling over a copy of this, then they're not rare, incidentally. This is quite affordable. I think I paid maybe £3.50. It still has a certain power and charm about it. So I've got to say up front, I'm not what you'd call a Trekkie. I mean, I've always enjoyed Star Trek, but I've never got into that level of obsessiveness, the degree that some people take it to. You're not going to get Klingon subtitles or any of that stuff. However, I will endeavour to do justice to this. This particular collection, I think, encapsulates quite well. Well, there are two stories out of these that there's a certain, I suppose, not necessarily a conflict, but there are these interesting situations where, I'm putting this in a very muddled, clumsy way, but Star Trek, if I'm reading the premise correctly, I think it came from a quite progressive place. From the time and place it was conceived, it, I suppose, could be seen to represent a more or less progressive thrust in thinking and politics. Now, the crew of the Enterprise, and I appreciate that not everyone is represented in the artwork here. It's narrowed down to what I suppose would have been perceived as the top four. So there's Kirk, Spock, McCoy and Scotty there. So we're leaving out Uhura, Chekhov and Sulu from the kind of more recognisable faces. However, there's a certain inclusiveness about Star Trek. But the mission of the Enterprise, you can see them as ambassadors for a planet Earth that has transcended its internal conflicts and differences. I mean, you can read it in the makeup of the crew. The significance of the fact that there's a prominent Japanese crew member who doesn't conform to standard stereotypes. So bear in mind the first series aired, 25 years after Pearl Harbor, and also it's hard to ignore actor George Takei's his own family history and background with light to events in the mid-20th century. There's some significance to the fact that you have a Japanese man in a prominent position. You have Lieutenant Uhura in a position of control and authority on the bridge. The Cold War was far from over at this point, but you have a prominent Russian crew member, Pavel Chekhov. So you're looking at ambassadors of, I suppose, a fairly united, harmonious Earth. That said, I mean, I suppose the principle of walk softly and carry a big stick, they do make their travels militarily packed still. In case it kicks off, they have an arsenal of photon torpedoes and phasers which can be set to a gentle stunning, or they can be set to kill. And they also have travel with their own seemingly inexhaustible supply of red-shirted suicide troops. But anyway, so what I suppose I'm leading up to is that, while they're a broadly progressive force, there's some interesting situations are presented in here where they're confronted with embodiments of an out-and-out subculture. The Starfleet still represents a certain level of military discipline, and they're confronted with a couple of cultures that openly regret this. So there's this kind of situation of conflict that presents itself there, which makes for quite interesting viewing, or quite interesting reading. Before we even get to those, also in this, I think, is what probably was, as a kid, one of my favourite episodes, and it's one that on subsequent viewings through life I've always found it's a slightly unsettling, quite haunting story, which I suppose it's one of the more high stakes kind of situations they find themselves in, which is the story, The Tholian, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, The Tholian Web by Judy Burns and Chet Richards. Incidentally, James Blish is credited as the author here, but he's basically adapting the scripts. In this one, the Enterprise is called to a distress call from the starship Defiant, and when they locate it, the sensors indicate there are no crew left alive. Now this starship, it's in what's described as a sort of unstable area of space. It's an area, and you'll kind of have to take my word for it on the science. I'm not sure how much scrutiny the science of this would take, but it's this stricken ship finds itself in an area of space in which the fabric is kind of unstable. I think it's the idea is that it's an area of space where different dimensions overlap. Now they managed to send down a boarding party, which I think is Kirk, Spock, Chekhov, is it McCoy, the other one? There's four of them. Anyway, when they materialise on this ship, they see evidence that an inexplicable mutiny has taken place. While they're on this ship, the Enterprise starts experiencing symptoms of the fact that this unstable area of space, and a power drain begins to happen to the Enterprise, so they're limited in what they can do. Now, having sort of run the tests and taken the samples, the crew require beaming back up, but because of all this technical weirdness going on, they can only operate 3 transporter channels, so they get everyone back except for Kirk. They are, however, lucky enough to have got a transporter lock onto him, but this weird thing seems to happen cyclically, that the ship then sort of disappears from the dimension which the Enterprise is operating, so they have to wait for this next interphase of these dimensions in order to try and snatch Kirk back. And meanwhile he's in this environmental suit, as they call it, so he's got limited oxygen, so he can only hold out for a while they're pondering the technicalities of this. Chekhov has arrived back complaining of a headache, and this then breaks out into this full-blown irrational rage. They have to sort of overcome Chekhov and try and figure out what's going wrong with him, and in the meantime they have to compute when the next interphase happens that they can pull Kirk back, supposedly. To add to their troubles, it transpires that they're in an area of space which is not considered neutral by the Tholians. The Tholians appear and fire a few warning shots, and then sort of come to an agreement that, all right, they're going to sort of sit tight until the next opportunity to beam Kirk back arises, and after that the Enterprise is in trouble. Now, when this interphase happens, they fail to bring the captain back. It doesn't work for some reason. So, having failed after the agreed time limit, the Tholians start kicking arse, and of course the Enterprise doesn't have enough in its power banks to set up their shields and to fire photon torpedoes back at the Tholians. So they're in this situation in which they kind of have to bluff the Tholians out, and Spock, now being the acting commander, has to make the call. Logic, as it were, would dictate that they're going to have to write the captain off. It'll be another couple of hours before they get, if another opportunity arises to snatch him back. He may not be alive by then, and they've got the welfare of everybody else to think about. And in the meantime, the Tholians hail another ship, and between them they kind of stretch out these energy beams in 3 dimensions with a view to wrapping it around the Enterprise. Now, in the meantime, more crew members, due to, I think their nervous systems are affected by this kind of strange imbalance. There are further kind of freakouts like Chekhov's been happening, and scientifically they have to sort of identify an antidote. Luckily enough, they do manage to pin down a treatment for this, which, as Scotty points out, isn't that unlike the effects of a good scotch. Scotty! Everything he says is kind of spelt out phonetically in the vernacular, so it'll never come out. I'm not even going to attempt it. And in the meantime, Spock and Bones, who, by nature are now at loggerheads to what the best thing to do is, and Bones is kind of advocating that they've got to go by regulations, and they're going to have to kind of consider that Kirk is lost and that Spock should be making that call and getting them out of there. However, I think actually this is a theme that recurs during the full-length films that happened in the 80s. The good of the collective versus the welfare of a certain individual, the conflict between those. Spock, I mean, almost against type, and you find in some of these stories he does surprise you and act outside of his usual kind of straightforward logic. Spock makes a call that while they've got a glimmer of a chance of still getting the captain back, they're going to kind of play this game of brinksmanship against the Tholians and bluff it out against them, and it's quite an emotional routine actually. They have to go into the captain's quarters and play. He's left this recorded last message in case he should disappear that Bones and Spock are going to have to sort of listen to and take a cue from. The next weird thing that happens is that various crew members start witnessing these phantom appearances of Kirk. This kind of glimmering apparition appears. I mean, he pops up in Uhura's quarters. Maybe true to form. You know, so they give her a sedative, but then it turns out other people are seeing this, and then they see it themselves. So there's this kind of glimmer that, well, he's still hovering out there. We still have this transporter lock on him. All the while, this web around them is closing. So, you know, naturally, you know, of course it all comes through in the end. They do manage to snatch him back. I think they sort of give the Tholians a trans-dimensional slit to get out of this. Like I say, don't ask me about the science of this. I don't know, but you know, they make a convincing case of it, so I'm not going to quibble. But I always found it one of the most powerful stories in the series, and I suppose it brings up certain philosophical questions and things like that, and it just an interesting situation, and it's just the quite haunting quality of that story, the idea of this ship not quite being in the same dimension as them and Kirk kind of being trapped within that. You know, I do feel is, you know, Star Trek, it does kind of transcend the 60s sci-fi kitsch at its best. I think that story is one where that's handled quite successfully. So from that one to the more countercultural themed storylines, the first of which is This Side of Paradise, which is credited to Nathan Butler and D.C. Fontana. Now this concerns a mercy mission that the Enterprise are called to make. They're directed to the assistance, rather, of the Sandoval colony on planet Omicron Cetai 3. Now, since this colony was set up, it transpired that the planet's sun was emitting dangerous Berthold radiation, which would be very dangerous for any life forms on the planet. However, the visiting party are astonished to discover that the members of this colony are all, while their livestock seems to have perished, but everyone is in rude good health. This is a bit of a scientific and medical mystery. The nature of this is first discovered by Spock, who it turns out, I'm not quite clear if she's a former squeeze of old Spocky, but one of this colony, Layla, they already know each other, and I believe it's Layla who first reveals to Spock the mystery of this colony's immunity. Behind this mystery are these pods that they're not native to that planet. They seem to have blown in from somewhere else, but these pods burst open and release these spores which will populate humanoid organisms. There's this symbiotic kind of relationship happens in which these spores will, not only are they protective, they also just restore you to kind of factory condition. In return for that, they get to sort of occupy you as a host. Another effect that they have is that they will transform your temperament to one of undemanding kind of bliss. So effectively, it turns anyone it infects into the most apathetic fucking stoner imaginable. And the first person to fall victim to this, weirdly, is Spock. So Layla is kind of, well, have you seen the light yet, Spock, kind of thing. And just then Kirk starts summoning him, and Spock is just, yeah, hey man. So it's, what do you want, Captain? I don't believe I want to obey that order. And he throws his communicator into the bushes and fucks off with Layla, kind of thing. So, well, yeah, he's the first one down, but they fall like 9 pins, and McCoy goes. He sort of reverts to the most kind of laid-back southern kind of, he's just rambling on about a mint julep or something. Pretty soon, almost the whole of the Enterprise has just kind of turned into Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. However, Kirk, for some reason, is completely untouched by this, and he's on his own pretty much on the Enterprise. Everyone else has just beamed down to sort of live a life of contented kind of whatever, man, down on the planet. But Kirk runs some tests, and he sooner or later figures out that the reason he's untouched is because he's so annoyed that the adrenaline within him, it just kind of dissolves these spores. So the key to this is to be really bloody angry. His tactic is, all right, well, the first I'm going to have to get under Spock's skin. And when Spock appears, Kirk begins his campaign of getting under Spock's skin, which consists of some highly inventive and very entertaining insults. Spock does take some getting to. What makes you think you're a man? You're an overgrown jackrabbit. You're an elf with an overactive thyroid. Captain, I don't understand. Of course you don't. You don't have brains enough to understand. All you've got is printed circuits. He then has a go about Spock's parents. What can you expect from a freak whose father was a computer and whose mother was an encyclopedia? You can see Spock is starting to get a little bit rattled. Kirk starts insulting the Vulcans. No more, said Spock stonily. I haven't even got started. Does she know, Layla, does she know what she's getting, Spock? A carcass full of memory banks that ought to be squatting on a mushroom instead of passing himself off as a man. You belong in a circus, Spock, not a starship. Kirk stepped forward and slapped the livid Spock twice. With a roar, Spock swung out. So he got there. When he says, oh, okay, Spock, have you had enough? Spock suddenly realises. So they get past that. They figure they can't really go through this routine with every single crew member. So they devise something that I think it's a communication signal. It'll piss everyone off. It's like one of those. Didn't Throbbing Gristle do this at a gig once? He sort of broadcast some horrible, annoying hypersonic frequency. So this ends on some sort of philosophical reflection. That's the second time, McCoy said, nodding towards the screen, that man has been thrown out of paradise. No, this time we walked away on our own. Maybe we don't belong in paradise, Bones, Kirk said thoughtfully. Maybe we're meant to fight our way through, struggle, claw our way up, fighting in every inch of the way. Maybe we can't stroll to the music of lutes. We must march to the sound of drums. It's getting a bit hawkish here, isn't it? Poetry, Captain, Spock said. Non-regulation. So, from that one to, I suppose, not a dissimilar theme, but to some might be considered the crowning glory of the original Star Trek, The Way to Eden by Arthur Heinemann and Michael Richards. This is the space hippies one. You think that last lot were hippies? These are hippies, right? So the Enterprise is called into this delicate situation in which they have to intercept 6 people who've stolen a cruiser. One of them is the son of an ambassador, so they have to handle it a bit tactfully. And once they're aboard, Scotty describes them as a nice lot. This extraordinary raggle-taggle crowd proved to be not terribly cooperative. They're calling everyone, or nearly everyone, is addressed by them as Herbert. Now it transpires Herbert is some minor official somewhere of notoriously inflexible mental capacity. They're proving to be a difficult crowd, so Kirk tries to come down and deal with them directly. Which one of you is Tongo Rad, who's a handsome humanoid despite the costume and an intangible air which often goes with wealth and privilege? He seems like a bit of an insolent type. The other problem is that they've done all this in Romulan space, thus risking a bit of a flare-up. Now, it turns out the one member of the Enterprise crew who gets, or in their language, reaches this crowd is, of course, Spock, who almost instinctively figures out that if he makes an egg shape and goes 1, he's able to establish a bit more of a rapport with them. In common with previous story, one of this lot turns out to be an old squeeze, not of Spock, but of Chekhov. I think he knew her in academy. But anyway, having established some rapport with Spock, he gets out of them that they were on a search for the planet Eden. They are followers of, I suppose, a rather manipulative type of character called Sevrin. Now, it's interesting they've used that name. I think that story's from a third series maybe, so it would have appeared within a couple of years of that Velvet Underground record, Venus in Furs. I don't know if there's any connection. It's an interesting choice of name anyway. The general assumption is that the planet Eden is a myth, but Spock, I think his attitude towards them is somewhere between sympathy and curiosity. Spock agrees that he will use the ship's resources to try and help them establish if this place exists. But in the meantime, at Severin's instructions, the various members of this hippie crew set out to kind of probe the Enterprise's weaknesses. In the meantime, a prominent member of this group is named Adam, and he is this deviant who's responsible for the performance of the musical score of this, in which, in fact, Blish has made a footnote, transcribes the lyrics from the various hippy-dippy songs that are memorably performed within this episode, and Blish notes, I much regret that I cannot reproduce the music which went with this script. It was of very high quality. The script I have does not name the composer. Now, as far as I can make out, the composers of the particular music in this episode are Deborah Downey, who played the blonde singer Girl Number One, co-wrote the music with Charles Napier, Adam. So Adam, with his space guitar thing, he arranges a bit of a jamboree in which Spock steps up for a bit of a session with his Vulcan lute. But these are all rather distractionary tactics for this. I suppose we can say they're a cult who, by manipulative means, succeed in momentarily wresting control of the Enterprise from the crew and directing the ship in the direction of this planet Eden. When they arrive there, they set up some kind of death trap on the ship that is narrowly averted. The crew who are left unconscious on the ship are going to be wiped out. The crew send down a party to the planet Eden, where it transpires this is far from the paradise that this cult had envisaged. It looks pretty, but also there's another complication to all this, in which Sevrin is the carrier of a potentially very infectious and destructive illness. So he seems unconcerned with this. He considers it his right to go where he wants, and the risks to anyone else, he's not concerned with that, which of course, has, I suppose, more contemporary resonances. So again, this return to paradise turns out to be anything but. The idea that Spock is the one, again, sort of contrary to the cold logic you'd expect of them, he's the one who kind of appreciates that there's nothing wrong in this cult's, their central cause. He appreciates the validity of that, because they're kind of alienated by this age of advanced technology that they live in. They seek this age of nouveau primitivism. Spock reaches of all the crew, but the reality of this, of course, is very different. So, from one angle, it's this highly entertaining bit of 60s countercultural kitsch, but, again, when Star Trek is firing on all cylinders, when it's firing on all dilithium crystals, it works on different levels. There are aspects to these stories that resonate a little deeper, but I forget how many in this series are. There's at least 7, but Blish, he adapts these scripts in very sort of bite-sized, digestible form, so very readable. I know this, of course, on demand now. In any episode of Star Trek, you can just call it up, but I still think there's some validity to these little treatments of it. So, always a pleasure to revisit. But you know how it goes. Oh, well, it's true, the changes I've gone through, and I hit one factor too. Where's Captain Kirk? Where's Spock?